Hi, everybody, and welcome to the FT's Digital Dialogues. I'm Brooke Masters of the Financial Times, and I will be your moderator today. We have a great panel. Rohit Kapoor, the CEO of EXL, Margot McShane, the MD of Russell Reynolds, and Chris Blunt, CEO of F&G Life. And we are here to discuss digital transformation and culture. And what we've all learned during the pandemic and what we can take into this new world we're coming into, and hopefully when we get out of our bedrooms, how exciting it's all going to be. Rohit, we were hoping you would get us going because you have done a really interesting thing in the pandemic, which is hire an enormous number of people entirely digitally and try to integrate them into your business. So do you want to get us going about how do you do that and how do you imbue culture in this kind of world?
Thanks, Brooke. I'm happy to talk about it. First off, I do believe that making sure that you can manage your talent and integrate them in and establish the right kind of culture, which includes innovation, is going to be a competitive advantage going forward. And those organizations that are able to do that seamlessly will, do it much better than others. But in this pandemic, we've got about 32,000 employees globally. And we had close to about 7,000 employees being hired digitally in the last 12 months. And there's a tremendous amount of learnings that we've had from this. But first, the positive part of it. Number one, we were able to do this at speed. We were able to get the right skill set and the right kind of employees for the right role. And I think we ended up doing a very decent job of the integration. But here's what we learned. One, when we hire people, there's a lot of work I think that now needs to be done even before the employee joins us. So pre-joining, our HR teams and our business teams make a huge amount of effort to make sure that it becomes a lot easier for our employees to join us. So what does that mean? It means we have digitized the onboarding process completely. So all the forms that are required to be filled in, all the learning procedures and manuals, everything is on a digital and an online format. And all of that work can actually be done by the prospective employee freehand even before he or she joins. The part that is needed in terms of hand-holding, that's of course done in a virtual video kind of setting. We help our employees be able to manage and navigate through that process. The second part of this is really when the employee joins us. And what we found is by structuring very many one-on-one conversations, that's very effective for new employees to understand us, understand what is the purpose of this organization, what are the core values that we embrace, what are the types of behaviors that we appreciate and we would like to kind of encourage. So building up on that team and making sure that purpose, values and behaviors are clearly identified and are reflected in every conversation, that becomes very, very meaningfully important. And then there's one piece which we weren't really doing previously in the physical world, which was really to loop back with the employee and be able to ask them, what have they missed? What have they learned? What are the things that we can improve upon in terms of this onboarding system? Because those first 60 days or 90 days, that's what makes a lasting impression on an employee, whether they want to be part of this organization and they want to build a career here, or if this is just not the right place for them and they ought to be thinking about moving out. So I think that critical moment of truth of bringing on an employee, pre-boarding, onboarding becomes really, really important.
We'll take it. Thanks so much. I think that's really important. Chris, this might be a good moment for you to jump in and talk to us about sort of younger line managers and how do they convey culture and this sense that we want you to employees, particularly in a hybrid environment, which seems to be what we're headed into.
Yeah, Brooke, thank you. I agree with that. I would say the number one strategic priority at our firm, like most companies, culture for us is everything. If you can maintain a constructive, positive culture, the best talent will want to come work in your organization. And so I worry about this a great deal of the tools that many of us were trained on how to lead, how to develop people, how to observe, is, I think, more challenging in this hybrid environment. And in the early going, I think everyone was in bunker mode of probably taking what they did every day and just trying to adapt to conference calls and Zoom calls. But I think for us and many companies, we've realized, that's not sufficient. We need to invest significantly in training, in development. I've always felt HR was important, but I think in this environment, it's exponentially important that we have an ability to teach best practice. How do you check in? How often do you have huddles? What are the right technology platforms to use? Zoom is helpful, but it's not the answer to every situation. How often should we be in a post-pandemic world gathering employees together? So similar to what Rohit said, there's the onboarding of employees. I think there's also the development of your leaders and trying to model and teach best practice. I think this is also an environment where it's uncovering some of the weaknesses in certain leaders. And so I think a lot of this is just basic development and training, but I think it's just absolutely critical.
Thanks so much, Chris. This is a good moment to bring in Margot, who specializes with working with people at the top of an organization. So Chris mentioned that some leaders are doing better than others. What are you finding from boards and CEOs about, how can they lead creatively in this current environment, and then as we open up?
Well, one thing I would say is what's been interesting for boards is to see what leaders have been able to step up during the pandemic and which ones have not. This is truly, for CEOs in particular, multivariable situation where you have to work with kind of fix some variables while keeping some options open for the future, and not every leader can navigate through that. And I think in terms of engaging your employees, it has been difficult, and I don't think there's a perfect playbook for this. I think, a theme that we are hearing, though, is that when you're dealing with Zoom and remote communication, it's easier for linear communication and coordination. It's also a little bit easier one-on-one, or in smaller group settings. It's much harder to co-create and innovate in this environment. And I think that's something that continues to be a challenge for CEOs and CHROs.
We're already getting questions in on which we really appreciate. So I think we'll jump onto those right now, because it's clear we have an engaged audience. And guys, do keep those questions coming. There's a chat function you can do it with. One of the questions is, do you think it's incumbent on leaders to give clear and early direction to their employees on future plans so that they can plan for their future, such as where to live? Which I think we're starting to see that. Microsoft recently said that it is actually interested in getting people back to the office, while Nationwide, which is one of the cooperative banks in the UK, has just said, actually, you know what, we're all staying home. What do you guys think? What's the best thing for people to do? Jump in, I would say.
So I'm happy to jump in on that, Brooke. I think one thing which has become abundantly clear is, as we move forward, the hybrid business model is here to stay in some shape or form. That's likely to be there. Now, some firms might have more of their workforce and in the office, others might have more at home, but it's not going to be how it used to be prior to the pandemic. So that's changed, I think, permanently. And when you take a look at that kind of a change, we polled our employees and asked them, well, what would you like to do once people get vaccinated and we can have the ability to get back to work? What is your particular preference? And in our poll, 50% of our employees say they would like to work from home and they'd like to come to the office occasionally. And another 20% would like to do a 50-50 split, meaning they would like to work from home and they'd also like to come to work in the office. Now, when you kind of factor that in, one thing is pretty clear. The commute to the office was a complete waste, and it is unproductive, and it results in lower employee satisfaction. And then the other thing is, it's very difficult to actually provide clear direction to the employees as to which business model the organization is going to adopt, because things are changing so much. we operate in 11 different countries. Actually, each country has its own infection rate going up or down, its own vaccination rates that are kind of, being administered. So it becomes a little bit more at the local level that kind of instruction or that kind of a guidance can be provided. And what we are trying to do is to do our best to provide as much visibility to our employees as possible, while retaining that flexibility of being able to kind of work from home and work from the office and create a flexible structure. I think what is needed is a social contract with our employees, which allows them to understand how the organization is thinking, be able to link up with the organization, and have trust and credibility in terms of all these decisions, which will be fluid as we move forward.
Margot, you've worked with boards. What are people thinking? And give any examples of something that's worked quite well in terms of giving people comfort about in a very fluid situation?
I mean, I would say first and foremost, I think a lot of organizations have been surprised how they actually can cope. They can manage effectively remotely. They've had to step up their game. When I look at it now versus a year ago, it's a stark difference in terms of the level of comfort. And particularly when you talk about boards meeting, they're doing more in committees with subgroups. There's a lot that's working. What is interesting, though, is two things. One is in the last 3 or 4 months, I have heard boards from saying, gosh, we're only going to go to 50% in-person meetings too. Actually, that's not quite right. It's going to be more like 75% because they're missing the relationship building that really can only happen together, as well as that sort of casual conversation or more comfortable conversation and discussing issues that happens in person. I'd say the second thing is just from a human element. I think whether you're a board or an hourly wage employee, I think this idea of humanity thriving on social interaction was understated early on. And for each person the point about the commute is well taken. A lot of people don't want to commute, but they need that downtime to restore, refresh, read a book, listen to music, whatever it is, the things people aren't making time for at home when they're in back-to-back video calls. So I think it's now equalized a little bit. People will be operating differently, but I think they underestimate relative to the beginning how important that human interaction in person is.
Chris, you were a part of a company that was involved in a major merger completely virtually, and therefore had to forge relationships entirely virtually. What lessons have you drawn from that? And perhaps how does that inform your plans going forward?
Sure, Brooke, happy to hit that, but maybe just to add one comment to what Rohit and Margot had said. I think one of the other challenges, though, is if time in the office is going to be more limited, that time needs to be extremely well managed. And so, we have found that we're going to be doing a lot less in-person client events just because of the nature of what's happened. So we've taken those resources and the team that has organized those so effectively and said, we want to put the same rigor around our internal interactions, meaning in my case, when I come to the office, I do not want to be on conference calls with other locations or Zoom calls. I want to be meeting with human beings. I want to be interacting. I want to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner with employees. And so it may sound obvious, but I think acknowledging that up front of saying you have to put all this, in fact, having very senior people leading that effort with the same passion they would in external interaction. As to the merger, we were acquired. So the acquisition was announced. We were purchased by Fidelity National Financial, the leading title insurance provider in the U.S. And then a couple of months after announcement, pandemic hits, a lot of business implications of that. But closing on a transaction in a digital world definitely added some challenges. But the only positive that came out of that was it was baptism by fire. We were forced to figure out how to adapt, how to do that culture building, that integration. And so I think part of the learning from that is the sooner you can acknowledge that this is the world that we're going to live in and put resources around it and drive it with the same intensity that you would any other strategic initiative, the sooner you're going to see success.
I'm struck by your effort to sort of maximize the value of in-person time if we're going to be living in this hybrid model. And it fits with one of the questions we've got, which is how do you promote innovation from a hybrid model? Rohit or Margot, does either of you have you all thought about what you can do to help foster innovation and creative thinking and interaction in a hybrid or mostly remote model?
Yes, Brooke. I think for us, innovation is the lifeblood of our business and for our growth, right? So it's extremely important. So we've thought about it in two different levels. One is how can actually we promote innovation at the ground level, at the grassroots level? Because we don't really need to have innovation just being driven at the top. We need to have that actually come from the people who are doing the work, who are seeing and who are closest to the business process and closest to the data that they're working on with their clients, and help us with that innovation. So we've set up a program which is called All Ideas Matter. And the responsiveness to that kind of a program that has been launched to all 32,000 of our employees has been phenomenal, because now what we are seeing is individuals are taking the initiative to come up with their ideas, make sure that they kind of write them down and they put forward those suggestions. And we have a process of being able to evaluate that, vet that, and to be able to institutionalize that. And we're getting many more ideas in the virtual environment than we did in the physical environment, because nobody really took the time to do that. So that's one. The second is, at the middle management level and at the senior executive level, innovation is more difficult to try and architect because we have so many structured meetings with fixed agendas and everybody is running back to back that you really don't have time to kind of focus on this kind of a thing. So we've tried to actually break that and have unstructured meetings. And again, an unstructured meeting with a large team on video doesn't really promote innovation much, because people talk over each other. You don't really get to building up on ideas. Using a whiteboard online, we've tried that, and it is hard. It is really hard to try and make that work. But what we are finding is, if you do some tangential activities, so we do things which are team building activities, which are completely unstructured, they actually allow for much better thinking, much better diversity of perspectives to be shared, and much better ideation, to be created. I will spend time with my team one-on-one on an unstructured format, once a month, which is to say there is no agenda. I don't want to talk about business. We can talk about anything that you'd like to talk about, and I don't have anything in my mind. And we find that those human moments, which normally would take place at the water cooler or might take place in a hallway, if you try and replicate that in an unplanned manner, which introduces spontaneity, that is really, really helpful. And we've seen, that ideation actually help us and move forward, because suddenly you say, hey, what do you think about this? And then you can build up on that.
Margot, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with everything that he's saying. And I don't want to repeat it, but I will just say what definitely does not work are these Zoom calls to try to brainstorm. Absolutely. Just they fall flat on their face. It's awkward, etc. I'm sure someone's going to do some study about human chemistry, and there is something that is different about in person. So I think to simplify this, individual ideation where someone's thinking on their own, they're going for a walk, they're exercising, based on a topic, and then coming together with a team to exchange ideas, that's working. But that visceral thing from a team is really impossible. So what I've seen is, let's say you're an apparel retailer or manufacturer or a gaming company. What they are doing is getting together in just smaller groups in person, socially distanced or outside, whatever makes sense. So groups of 4 to 6, because they just can't duplicate that offline.
It's really interesting. We were talking about the problem of in-person versus online. We've had a really interesting question. Somebody cited the Goldman Sachs, oh my God, I'm dying PowerPoint. And actually I wrote my column about it this week. And what they said is coming onto that clearly now that UBS has come out, Credit Suisse has come out, everybody's kids are dying. Is there something that both sort of trainers and also business schools can start to do to say, okay, you're coming out into a world where some of this is reality. You're stuck in your apartment working long hours. What can be done to prep these kids? Because they aren't coming, like when I'm working horrible hours, I know the people I'm working with, it's not nearly so bad. Are there skills we can give them? Do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Sure, I'll start. I think some of this is there needs to be more EQ training in business school. let's all, I'm a business school graduate myself, and there was none, and so some people naturally have it, others evolve it over time. I think it actually ties to the innovation point from before, because one of the indirect benefits I'm seeing from some of the digital world is how to draw people out. When you're in person, extroverts dominate. They talk more, they're more comfortable talking over colleagues. And so this ability, a little more structure to meetings of calling on people, allowing people to submit questions online, I think we're getting more ideas that are surfacing. I think to this quality of life issue, we've been experimenting with a lot of things, forcing certain time slots where there are no meetings, period. Right? So people can literally, and I mean this, go to the bathroom, get something to eat, because there's no boundaries anymore for all of us. The world seems 24/7. And some of that is sensitivity training of managers. We all get hundreds of daily emails and we all want to get them off our plate. But you need to know, if you are someone's boss's boss and you send that on a Saturday morning, you're creating anxiety for somebody who's now feeling that they need to respond by noon on Saturday type of thing. So I think it's some of those little trainings that companies need to do probably first and foremost, but it would be good if some of the business schools picked up some of that best practice.
And Brooke, I'll just add to that. I think a college, if I may just add to that, I think a college graduate from university, they are actually much more adept in terms of using video technology and conferencing technology, and it comes naturally to them. So it's a lot easier for them, and there are many things which I think we, as more mature adults, can learn from them. So that's one. But I think to Chris's point on EQ, I just want to emphasize one of the things which really is necessary is how to collaborate and how to work in a team. And I think what the colleges can do is to give projects to the students and let them work on these projects and initiatives, which they typically would have done physically in a room or getting together, working in a virtual environment across geographies. So not just on the campus or not just in that particular local area, but if you had to work across, you had, let's say you paired up Stanford with Harvard or otherwise, and you made them work on a joint project together, that would be fascinating, because working in a team structure, building on somebody else's idea, trying to kind of take the ball forward and kind of articulating it, appropriately, that's the kind of a skill set which is very, very important to kind of get integrated into the organization. And the last piece is, I think one of the challenges for new young college graduates joining the workforce is, in the past, most of their learning would come by observing behavior. They would observe behavior about their colleagues, they would observe behavior about the leaders, they would observe behavior about others, and now that observability is taken away. So I think we as organizations need to introduce mechanisms so that can be made more visible to them, and that's going to be very important.
Margot, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, I think in general, there are a lot of new skills that need to be adopted. I think just because you can doesn't mean you should. I think what's been going on is everyone has just been in back-to-back virtual meetings. It's completely exhausting. They're horrible boundaries. And so boundaries have to start to be manufactured, much like Chris was saying, where you have to have a bio break or have lunch or whatever it is. I think it's actually an opportunity with new employees to get them on the right path by training them. And I would say employers are starting to have to overly invest in onboarding for the things that you take for granted in your first week at work. So extra time up front to get them grounded in that. But it's also an opportunity for heads of HR and CEOs to sort of test new ways of working with new employee populations, because people just can't sustain this.
There's another really good question, which is how are you adopting your hiring strategies? And in Margot's case, how are you adopting the companies you advise as hiring strategies in this sort of return to work, not just with onboarding, but in terms of who you select? And, has this made people more interested in accepting remote workers or, other things? What's going on in your world?
Yes, first of all, it's been amazing how people have, other than the first couple months, just because of all the seismic change in the economy, we have been as busy as ever, which is not exactly what we expected. So the bottom line is that companies have hired soup to nuts in the pandemic in a way that we didn't quite expect. In terms of the remote and the location, I would say yes, employers are more open to that. I think many employees nonetheless are still expecting to have to relocate in certain instances once they actually can come out of the pandemic. What's interesting though for employers is that we're seeing them just in general open to people being in different states and then rethinking their benefits. So specifically, how do you think about the cost of living in Austin, Texas versus California versus New York? Do we go to a different kind of benefits program where you pick your own healthcare program? You pick your own relocation package. So we're seeing it showing up in benefits and employers relooking at that as they have a more dispersed employee base.
Chris or Rohit?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think for us, we had this wake-up call moment where we lost a top candidate because the company we were competing against was very clear on the ability to work remotely. And we realized we were dithering a bit and we needed to get together as a leadership team, which we did literally the next day, and came to the conclusion, I think the right one, that we needed to greatly expand our openness to remote work, to hybrid work. We're now in the process of trying to set standards. What does hybrid work mean? How often do you need to be in the office to have a dedicated office, for example? How do we make sure that if people are remote, their career trajectory is not limited? I think that's a big issue we're all going to have to wrestle with going forward. So the indirect benefit of this, which I think is enormous, I think our ability to move the needle on DEI issues goes up pretty dramatically, because now the world is your oyster. It is not, I'm looking for the best candidate and I'm trying to limit not only to a professional pool, but a geographic pool. If we now say, well, gosh, if you're within a couple time zones of our office, frankly, that's good enough. I think we open up a rich pool of talent that perhaps we didn't have access to before.
I think Chris's point on DEI is really, really important. I think in this new hybrid virtual world, having access to a different and a more open talent pool, that's really been very helpful. Of the 7,000 employees that we hired, 45% were female employees, and that's phenomenal for us because we've been able to kind of shift the needle on that. But more importantly, hiring at middle management and at senior executive, that's become even better. Again, because the relocation is not such a big deal because the person can work from where they are. Our hiring from smaller cities as opposed to the larger cities, that's gone up quite significantly. And we're moving to this concept of what we call as a pod, which means that people can be in a particular region or in a particular geographical area and work from home, and then they can come to a central spot out there to meet and to engage and interact with other colleagues. And that pod is something that can be distributed across the world. So we can have multiple pods and multiple, groups and teams of, employees that are working from home and that can connect They don't necessarily all need to come to headquarters. They can all kind of be there in that respective geography and that.
On the DEI issue, actually, I mean, it does sound great. You obviously have a broader pool of candidates, which is great, particularly if certain types of diversity aren't available near your home office or are harder to get. But there's also a lot of evidence that women and minority groups in particular have been hit much harder by the pandemic and the demands of schooling and family care. What, if anything, can companies do to make sure that you don't lose the minority folks you have or the women you have, and make sure that the organization is open to these problems?
Yeah. So the number one, I guess thing to do is to offer flexibility, right? Because and one of the things which we now do is, an employee would like to take a phone call or a Zoom meeting only on audio, we are actually happy to allow them to do that, and they don't necessarily need to be on video. And they can be attending to other things that they have to kind of take care at home while doing that. Also, I think the time when work needs to be done, that distinction between work time and personal time has actually blurred quite significantly, right? So giving those employees that are more challenged in that 9 to 5 kind of a time period, when they're also looking after their children, or they might have to look after an elder parent, or they might have to look after some other duties they have, but they are able to spend time outside of that work time window and complete their work, either on the weekend or in the late evening or early morning, whatever, allowing them the flexibility to do that. We find that's very, very helpful and accommodative as well. So the big thing really is about how do you get flexibility and fluidity in terms of your operating style and structure, so that you can continue to engage with these employees, which certainly are being challenged a lot more heavily than they were previously.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is that I think the first order issue is ask. And it's probably not a coincidence that one of the female executives on my team uncovered this issue early on, that we had in particular a lot of working moms who now are homeschooling kids and trying to balance a 60-hour-a-week job, and the tremendous stress that was creating. And merely the fact that she was attuned to this and she asked the question of how can we help. We ran a pilot program. I can't tell you that it was wildly successful. It's too early to find out, but we actually hired as interns a bunch of the kids, teenagers of some of our employees, particularly in our operations group, where we had extra work. There was some time on our part to train them, to help out. One, we got a source of labor to help us during a pretty stressful period of time, but it was a double win, because now we had some teenagers who were occupied, particularly during the summer. So, again, is that a giant needle mover? Probably not. But the biggest benefit I think we got was that we were trying. We didn't know the answer to this, but we were at least attuned to this is a big issue and something that's not going to go away just when kids are back in school. The reality is, if you're a parent with young children, when you're home, you're home. You really can't say to your kids, I'm not mom or dad for the next 9 hours. That's not how it works.
And just to build on that, I think it put a finer point on gender inequality. And if you look at the statistics, women in general bear the burden of child rearing more than males, even if they're both employed. And so that has really come to light when you've seen the women drop out of the workforce. I think to Chris's point, I think, best in class sort of practice is to really not just be flexible, but really drill down on the core issue here and get them support. I mean, I've seen employers give stipends for support, but it really is, it's the bigger problem that's gone on for a while that we're really now seeing our employers, dealing with, in new ways.
We have an interesting question from the audience about trust. Now that everyone's had to sort of lose physical control over their employees and hope that whatever they're doing is not just putting their feet up and eating donuts. do we think the problem of sort of spyware and monitoring and building a sense of trust and allowing people to finish their work at non-work hours, has that been solved, or it just sort of papered over in the pandemic?
Well, I guess I would say, and maybe it's just philosophical. I don't think you can run an organization as a taskmaster. So if you've hired the right people, if you've instilled a good culture, I think you know who's productive and who's not. We like most companies have found productivity is off the charts. It's actually too high right now. So if you say, well, can productivity be too high? Yeah, it's too high right now. I don't think it's sustainable. I think people are at risk of burning out. So we've been hiring like mad, trying to keep up with volumes and everything else. But this notion of, if you're not online 9 hours a day, you're not productive. I think we all know that's not true. There's a level of nonstop engagement where productivity actually declines pretty dramatically. So we're a rather employee light company for our size. We've only 450 employees. So maybe it's a bit easier for us to tell if someone is not, doing their fair share of the rowing every single day. But at least for us so far, I don't think this has been an issue.
So I do think that the era of rigid policies and procedures and being prescriptive about it is completely gone. You cannot have that. And, when the health of your employees is paramount, you need to be making sure that you're doing everything possible to make sure, first and foremost, that they're safe, secure, and healthy. And once they are safe, secure, and healthy, then we can focus in on the outcome and the productivity and kind of work on that. So when I talk about this social contract, it's really about building that trust between the employer organization and the employee. And that social contract and that trust needs to be earned, it needs to be nurtured, and it needs to be developed. It's not something which will happen overnight. And spyware is actually exactly the opposite thing that anybody should be thinking about doing, because you're not really delegating, you're not trusting your employees, and it's not going to be something that you can force anybody to kind of adhere to as such. It being self-driven and being worked out on the basis of outcome and value that the individual is contributing, having open conversations around that, sharing as much of information as possible, and actually stepping up the communication. That's much more important to be able to build and create longer lasting trust. And I do think that trust will need to be built and earned as organizations move forward, and will be a critical success factor in terms of whether the company is being competitive or not.
Margot, I see you nodding. Do you want to jump in?
Agree with everything. I think everything Rohit is saying is particularly true with the younger employee set, who are just they're used to working in a virtual world. They expect you to trust them, and I think the mentality has gone from hourly productivity to project productivity.
Speaking of generations, we've had a question actually about. I think there's two questions I'd like to ask. One is, there's a whole thing about millennials being different. And you have to manage them differently. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about how that runs into the pandemic. But also on the other end, sort of older employees who suddenly had to be more techie. What have you been able, or what can we do to make sure that those people continue to feel included and don't end up the sort of introverts in the corner who never participate anymore because this isn't their world. They're not tweeters.
Yeah, I'll maybe start on the second one. So, we have a, member of my executive team by their own admission of a classic walk around manager and very gifted walk around manager who I think did struggle initially with this new world order as many of us have. And I think if there was a miss on our part as an organization, it was probably not acknowledging that up front and devoting real resources. Because one of the questions I think was along the lines of, training. Well, the reality is we're not training people to program. We're training people how to use Zoom, and how to do maybe an effective video message versus sending an email. So I don't think it's deep technical, but there is training involved. It's a different way of working. And so I think for us, probably early on, we may have missed an opportunity to say, let's put someone in charge of this and not take for granted that everyone's going to be able to adapt to a new way of working. My only comment on the millennial one is I think a lot of it's overplayed. It's fun to write about. It's interesting, the back and forth between, my generation of boomers and millennials. But at least my experience has been, while there's been some delay, a lot of the same patterns and trends are being followed. So a little bit of a warning of sometimes I think too much gets made of that.
Rohit, Margot?
I just will say quickly, I think this has been equalizing because every generation's in this together. Yes, maybe some folks stumbled at the beginning. Yes, maybe a younger person is a little bit more adept and they can deal with the multi sort of functional aspects of video conferencing. But I actually think it's been a great event in terms of bringing them together.
I would agree. On the older generation, I would talk about our board, which the average age is higher than the rest of the organization. And they, I think, adapted to this change really, really well because using Zoom is intuitive, it's easy. And once you get the hang of it, it's actually, much, much more helpful than just being on an audio call. There is an incentive to try and do that as well. So I just think, to Margot's point, this has been quite a leveler for everybody between generations. And some of us have now learned to play video games. I mean, I did, my management team offsite meeting, and we did a virtual escape room. And, initially everybody was like, what are you going to do? Escape room, which those teenagers do? So yeah. And then they did it and they loved it. And it made for a terrific bonding exercise. So I think it's leveled the playing field, to Margot's point, tremendously.
This question might be a good one for Margot to lead off on, which is we have a question from the audience about how do leaders need to change? Is there a different profile required of a CEO? And so Margot is the external. I'd love to hear your view. And then Chris and Rohit as CEOs, what do you think?
Yeah, happy to do that to begin. First of all, as I said, there has been no playbook for this, and it has been surprising who has stepped up and who hasn't. It's actually surprised boards quite a bit. Some of the people they did not expect had the agility to do this have come to the forefront, and other people they've been disappointed in. So I think there are going to be some long-term sort of ramifications of that for employee sets. But I would say there's 6 specific qualities that have emerged, particularly with CEOs, as being sort of best in class in terms of where they really spike. I mean, I think one is bravery, authenticity and empathy, being purpose driven, strategic and operational sharpness, the ability to play offense and defense, so the agility to do both, as well as thinking in terms of multiple horizons along that. And then I say lastly, digital acceleration, whether it's for your customer base or internally. It's also that last point sort of puts has shed some light on those organizations which were well suited coming into this and didn't have to play a lot of catch up. It also allowed them to continue to deal with not just the short term, but to pursue their longer term strategies, depending on how much catch up they had to do.
Chris, you want to give your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe play off a couple things that Margot said. I think one, to this empathy point, it's even more important than it used to be. Perhaps in the old days, you might say, I don't care if he or she is the nicest person, if they're a competent leader and the company's headed in the right direction. I do think that has changed. The old adage of no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So I think we've leaned into a lot of those softer things. One, because we do care about our employees and their experience. But I think that empathy goes a long way. And the other, to the mission-driven piece, I think it's critical. We're a very mission-driven organization. Our mission statement is helping people turn their aspirations into reality. And I think that's also accelerated because, in a world where you're under stress, you're working harder, you've got all these, external challenges. If you've lost the plot and you don't feel particularly great about what the company does and why it deserves to exist and how is it making the world a better place, I think you're at great risk of high turnover in your organization. And so I think this is the number one strategic issue. So the only other thing I would say at the top of the house, like this, again, has to be something that you drive with the same amount of passion that you drive around financial results. Is culture? Are people being heard? Do they think it's a great place to work? Does they think that the organization does meaningful things to make the world better? And, I got to be honest, like post COVID, I spent time on this before, but I probably spend a third of my time and every single day on this topic.
Yeah, I think, in this kind of a period of continued uncertainty, two things get amplified very significantly. One is the ability of the CEO to provide, the vision, the clarity, and to Chris's point, to provide the purpose of why that organization exists and what we're going to do to kind of move forward. Everybody is looking up to the CEO to understand, all right, how are we going to deal with this threat and with this change? What happens? And what's now in many situations it's not clear. And to that, Margot's point is really important about being authentic. So I think the CEO has to stand up and say, look, these are pieces which are unclear at this point of time, or these are risks for us at this point of time. We'll deal with it, and this is how we're dealing with it, and engage with the employee base so that they can see that you're being authentic and you're relating to the purpose, which is the North Star, and then you're driving the organization forward. So that aspect becomes really, really important. The second part, which I think becomes very important, is the CEO has to demonstrate empathy and humility. I think listening to your employees and really understanding what is the pain point that they are going through, and understanding that and taking steps to alleviate that, listening to them for how the organization can improve in this kind of environment becomes critical, which I think sometimes you can miss because you're focused on doing so many different things and so many meetings that you're not listening to the music. You're just hearing, the words that are being said to you. So I think both on the aspect of being authentic and linking to the purpose and making sure that the organization is clearly aligned, and engaging with the employees and really listening to them and empathizing with them, I think that becomes very, very important in a leader.
We've had a really thoughtful question about, we're a year into this pandemic in most places now. So we're coming up on performance reviews. How is your company dealing with performance reviews? Because many people have given more than they frankly should or could and cannot continue. How do you cope with that? You don't want to devalue the hard work they've put in, but at the same point, obviously they can't keep doing it. So, and you can't obviously say do better this year in some cases. What are your companies doing, Chris and Rohit? And Margot, have you talked to companies about how this works?
Yeah, maybe just quick comment. I think some of this is really important dialogue with your board. Does your board recognize that? So our board was just incredibly generous in terms of the scorecard. This was a year where for most companies, you had to have a subjective scorecard because the whole world blew up in February, March. And so it was very hard. Generally, when most companies would be setting all of their strategic targets. And so I think that was great. So a little bit of like the battle needs to be won in the boardroom first. We also have paid out a lot more project bonuses than we ever had before, just because it was an excuse and it was something we had at the ready to say to folks, hey, in addition to everything else that's going on, you worked on the closing of the transaction, or you worked on this particularly big project. So there was more of that. But I think the other thing we learned is that money can only go so far. If you're completely maxed out and home is stressful and, it's nice to have a bonus, but that's not your biggest driver. And so some of the things we've done, frankly, is we've overhired in a few places just to give some mental relief. And I think for a lot of employees, we didn't do this, but if you went to them and said, you can have a slightly bigger bonus, or we can hire one more person in the department so you can work fewer hours and actually have a semblance of a life, many would have chosen the latter.
Yeah, I think this is an important philosophical question and an actionable, piece as well. We chose Brooke in our organization to take a look at performance of our business and the extra amount of effort that everybody else, put in terms of helping the company navigate this pandemic and this challenge and come out successful. Now, we missed our goals that we had set for ourselves at the beginning of the year, and we were a bit short of that, from a revenue perspective, just because of the impact that took place. But we also knew that everybody did not only their very best, but actually went way out of their way to make sure that the organization is well positioned and that we will continue to build and grow the organization. So what we decided to do is pay everybody a bonus which is uniform and exactly the same bonus for everybody, because everybody pulled in terms of making the organization move forward. And we wanted to recognize the collaboration, the teamwork, and the what every individual really did in terms of moving the organization forward. So from me down to the junior most executive, the same level of bonus payout for the executives, and that built a huge amount of trust within the organization. And then also the level that we chose was well above what we would have normally paid if we had just gone by the bonus plan. So actually, the board was very generous in terms of making sure that we recognize that extraordinary effort that everybody else put in. So I think we ended up in a very, very nice place.
Margot, thoughts?
Well, so a few different thoughts. One is what we've seen as a best practice is boards, CEOs, C-suite cutting their compensation before employees. I mean, to Rohit's point, that's how you build trust. It was actually quite inspirational how many organizations chose to do that without even knowing what each other was doing. There was a lot of doing the right thing. And I think Chris mentioned it, but this sort of mentality of just trying to produce shareholder value as opposed to thinking all stakeholders, that really came to light. At a company-wide level, remember, there have been some winners and losers. Even though I think about culture as almost like a savings account, where a lot of organizations, if they had a big savings account going in this pandemic, they've been drawing it down. For many organizations, it's been a galvanizing event, and they've actually accelerated their growth. So there's some companies that perform very well, and they're all reaping the rewards. I think in general, for those who actually do need to, at an individual level, decide what people's compensation was, we have heard companies say, listen, everyone has a story. We can't begin to evaluate apples to oranges. We really just have to look at productivity and maybe round up for each person. So we've seen organizations try to get out of that because it's just too difficult. I think they're just assuming people have done their best and been as flexible as they can to accommodate them. But when it comes to individual compensation, that can't quite be evaluated. It gets unfair and to all employees.
And Margot, to your stakeholder point, one thing that we also leaned into community involvement during this period of time, and it wasn't because we were so brilliant at the top of the house. We were sort of pulled there by our employees, and we just realized this was an opportunity to further who we were in our local communities where we worked. And I think that had a very motivating, it's back to the mission-driven aspect of this. Part of it is, what does the company do and what's its good in the world? But it was also the volunteerism. We stepped up our corporate donations, our personal donations on the executive team. And it was a way of taking a crappy environment and maybe reminding all of ourselves that there's people that, are suffering much worse during this period. But it was a great bonding opportunity, particularly for some of those newer employees. So, whatever we did was not a one-time step up. I think it's the new normal for us.
We are actually coming to the end of our allotted time, and in part of this work from home era, you're supposed to finish on time so everyone can get to the bathroom before their next meeting. So I wanted to thank you guys, and then I have one final little tiny question that I thought might be fun to go out on. But first of all, it's been a great panel. I think we've talked a lot about how there's more to this than we might think, and it's important to build cultural capital and different ways we can do it. And I think that's been really helpful. And you guys have been really open about sharing what's worked. And I think hopefully the readers appreciate it. The watchers appreciate it. Quick question this is again from some brilliant audience member, is if your family could answer this question, should you keep working from home personally, what would they say? And I will say my family would say mom needs to go to work at least some of the time, but she's too loud and she needs people. How about you guys?
So I'm happy to go first. I've got 2 kids, one in college, one working post-college, and me. We all go into separate rooms and we work, from there. My college-going kid certainly wants to get back to college and be there. And I think for me, I think it'll be better if I am at work than being at home. I step on too many toes.
Chris, you want to go?
I'll just share a lesson, which sharing an office with your spouse is not a good idea. So that was probably the first learning. I was pretty promptly booted out, so I learned that pretty quickly. But yeah, I would actually say it's been the only positive blessing as I get to do what I do, and I do spend a lot more time with my wife, which has been actually quite nice. I won't speak for her though. She may say a few more business trips might be okay.
Margot?
I think I have to travel a lot for my job, so I think they'd say they'd rather me be at home. Although I have to be honest, I'm ready to get back. I have 3 teenagers. So I'm ready to have a little bit more of a mix here.
Sounds good. Well, thank you guys. It really has been a great panel, and thank you to the audience. That you gave us lots and lots of really great questions to work with, and thank you very much. And have a good day, everybody. Run off and get your drink of water, whatever you need. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.